Hey everybody, my name is John Truden. I'm a graduate student in the Department of History at the University of Oklahoma. My research mostly focuses on Indigenous settler relationships, particularly the ways that Native people used those relationships with settlers to combat their erasure in Oklahoma. So today I'm going to talk to you about three people, well, really two people and a group that design strategies that I call endurance strategies, but I mean, you can call it persistence or just uh, kind of endurance. They design strategies to navigate a really difficult period in central Oklahoma, in which white people, particularly white settlers, targeted them and tried to take their land. Before I get into all that, though, it's important to acknowledge we're on native land. I'm in Norman, so I live on what was our Wichita and Caddo ancestral lands, Osage and Comanche hunting grounds. There was a time when the Apaches lived here as well. The Chickasaw Nation is across the river. This is the citizen Pottawatomi and Absentee Shawnee nations actually overlap with Norman. And there is a big an Absentee Shawnee community that is right on Norman's eastern fringe. OU also has a large Native community, and since I'm in the southernmost part of the unassigned lands, this is once Creek and then Seminole land. The land that I live on, and the land that we all live on in Oklahoma, is Native, and Native communities continue to endure and persist here, and are actually resurgent. But it's just essential in talking about Oklahoma broadly to say that you can't talk about Oklahoma history without talking about the 39 Indigenous nations that are here. And so I just want to acknowledge that. So without further ado, I'm going to get into my presentation. I hope you enjoy it. So, like I said, I'm going to talk to you about central Oklahoma during what Angie Debo, Oklahoma's greatest historian, called the Orgy of Exploitation, a period in which white settlers targeted and just attacked Native people to get their land. So to start off, I want to tell a story. Picture this with me. It's September 1891. It's probably a hot day, if you're familiar with Oklahoma. A man named Thomas Wildcat Alford, the old man you see in the picture, is readying his horse. Now, Alfred was a young man at this time, and he recounted this experience in his book, Civilization, in the 1930s. Imagine that Alfred is waiting next to a seemingly endless line of people, some with wagons and horses, some on foot, all standing, waiting along this imaginary line. In front of this line is are lands the United States has broken up from Native peoples, including Alfred's band of white Turkey Absentee Shawnees, and is redistributing them to white and U.S. citizens. This crowd does not smell good. It's been on the border for several days, and so I would tell you to imagine the smell of feces and sweat and red dirt kind of rolling continuously through the crowd. In fact, I probably would imagine that the soldiers who are standing a few yards away are probably, keeping the crowd from jumping forward, are probably wrinkling their noses. All at once, one of them raises his gun and shoots it in the air. The crowd surges forward over the imaginary line, and they began pounding wooden stakes into the ground to claim the land because they're claiming homesteads. Alfred, even though he's Native, he's a white Turkey Absentee Shawnee, makes the run, and he files on not one, but two homesteads, and sells both of them successfully. Now, you may be wondering, technically under homestead law, you don't own the homestead until 5 years after residing there, and you certainly just can't file two. But Alfred's kind of existed in this borderland. This area is not well policed in the late 19th century, so Alfred is able to take advantage of this and actually regain a small portion of lost white Turkey Shawnee land by filing a homestead on what was once the Shawnee and Pottawatomi reservation in what is now central Oklahoma. The legal paradoxes that are inherent in someone like Alfred filing two homesteads are what I'm going to talk to you about today. The way that the federal government failed to really enforce the law in that in this region, and what I would say is central Oklahoma, Indian country, or really Lincoln, Pottawatomi, Cleveland, and parts of Payne County. The federal government's failure to enforce the law, particularly during the 1890s, but in general, proved dire for Native communities there. It profoundly threatened their tenure over the remaining land they had after the government finished breaking up reservations in that area. Before we get into that, though, I want to just say we're not as familiar, and I would say we as in like the audience of people studying Oklahoma history. In general, the peoples of this region, the Absentee Shawnee, the Citizen Pottawatomi, the Sauk and Fox Nation, the Iowa Nation, and the Kickapoo Tribe of Oklahoma, all of these people groups are less familiar than, say, like the five tribes. Those peoples came to the American South to Indian Territory in roughly 2 decades. The Algonquian and Siouan peoples that I'm going to talk about to you today, they came from the Great Lakes region over the course of several centuries. And often they stopped in these intermediate homelands. In fact, a lot of them stopped in Kansas and then were kind of pushed out of Kansas in the 1870s. So their journey to Indian Territory was very different. There's just not as many indigenous people in this region. You can see this even in the geography of their territory. So Angie Debo famously wrote about the way fraud affected the five tribes. And so we're also, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with where the five tribes are, but as you can see on the screen here, right, there's the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Nation, the Choctaw Nation, the Seminole Nation, and the Chickasaw Nation. But as you can see, this area is much larger and there were more people living there. In contrast, this is roughly the scale of the area I'm talking about, central Oklahoma, as Indian communities. So if you look over here, kind of on the far left, right, this just isn't as large of an area. And it's also important to note that in addition to a different journey to Oklahoma, they were really different in a lot of other ways. They had different religions, they wore different clothing, they lived in different kinds of houses, they spoke different languages. What they have in common with the five tribes is that settlers targeted them to take their land in the same way that Angie Debo described in her famous book, And Still the Waters Run. If you're not familiar with the Orgy of Exploitation, the event that Angie Debo used kind of to label that, I'll just describe it briefly. Settlers ranging from business people and neighbors to an Oklahoma governor and several U.S. senators defrauded the five tribes, swindling them out of their wealth. I would argue that, and I think many other scholars will argue too, the Orgy of Exploitation can be extended to other parts of the state and other parts of the United States. For example, there's a great book on the White Earth tragedy in Minnesota that has direct parallels with Oklahoma, both in time and in the way that allotment affects Native communities. However, the story of how this plays out in Pottawatomi and Lincoln counties in particular is interesting because the county administration targets Native people by overtaxing them and then seizing their assets. So through a combination of aggression and misinformation, these county assessors attempted to fill the coffers of the county with Native wealth. For example, when a Pottawatomi County sheriff seized Little Captain's horse for unpaid property taxes, the former did not tell the latter Absentee Shawnee man why he seized the horse, or even why he was going to do so. When Little Captain returned for his horse, the animal was just gone. Now, practices like this were very common, and you can, if you're interested in learning about it, there's this great file in the Oklahoma Historical Society that talks about taxation, and that's particularly in relationship to the Sauk and Fox Agency. And in that file, you will find letters from both the Indian agent and from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, both part of the Office of Indian Affairs, the agency that was responsible for protecting Native land held in trust by the federal government. And in those letters, what you'll find is that the agents are like repeatedly saying, hey, you can't tax land held in trust by the federal government, which for tax purposes is federal land, even though it is owned by Native people. the basic principle that, states can't tax federal land was long established by 1890. And throughout the 1890s, what happens is that Pottawatomi and Lincoln County just kind of ignore that principle. The federal government doesn't really have the means to kind of go after them. And so what essentially happens is a paradox where Native people are profoundly threatened. I just want to really illustrate, by the way, this is an important principle even today. Under the state administration, the governor seems to have the illusion that states have sovereignty over indigenous nations, and that's not true. Indigenous nations are direct partners with the United States. They have treaties, so they're effectively foreign nations. State governments are under the sovereignty of the United States. Therefore, states do not have sovereignty over indigenous nations. That plays out in the way that Pottawatomi and Lincoln County collected taxes, and they seem really mundane, but hounded by Pottawatomi County authorities, for example, some Shawnee landowners simply abandoned their allotments and fled north into the Muscogee Nation, and those tactics freed up land. In other instances, the county assessors in Lincoln County sent the U.S. Marshals from Chandler to Stroud, the Sauk and Fox Agency, and harassed Native people. In 1895, Commissioner of Indian Affairs D.M. Browning wrote, quote, that the indigenous people at the agency found themselves robbed of their property by the authorities of the territory. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs consistently acknowledged that this abuse was going on and couldn't really do anything about it is kind of indicative of the federal government's failure to protect Native interests. And essentially what really began to happen, which is interesting in Pottawatomi County, is that the county began using the assets it seized to fuel its police force and then make more raids on Native communities. So you have this cyclical attack on Native communities happening in the 1890s. It is violent, it is destructive, and it is an effective way of pushing Native people off of land that otherwise is considered, for the intents and purposes of taxation, to be federal and therefore not taxable. Particularly when they're now, it's important to distinguish that these counties were taxing what is called personal property, allotments and other homesteads and other properties that are held by the federal government would be considered real property. And personal property is essentially everything besides your real estate. The county both county administrations in Lincoln and Pottawatomi County understood that they could not directly tax allotments. At least they understood it after the first couple of years, after kind of confusingly trying to do that. So they started taxing personal property, like Little Captain's horse. Or in this other case, in Stroud and the Sauk and Fox Agency, Lincoln County started to overtax the goods of Moses Keokuk, Sauk and Fox merchant. This is the first person I want to talk about today. Moses Keokuk was an established trader at the Sauk and Fox Agency. He established his trading post in just a few months before the September 1891 land run at the Sauk and Fox Agency. Unlike, say, Little Captain, he had the means to fight. When Lincoln County's white residents started harassing Native people. So just as a further explanation, one of the reasons that the counties were looking so at Native land to tax it was both because people like Moses Keokuk, who had successfully acquired a large amount of wealth, but also because these new counties were mostly homesteads and allotments, and both of those lands are held in trust for a certain period by the federal government. They can't be taxed by county administrations for real property taxes because they're both held in trust. Because the basic principle that the state cannot tax federal lands. And so because of that, Lincoln County in particular began to just hemorrhage money. Like they didn't have enough money and funds, and they would continue to struggle with this throughout the early 20th century, really into the 1920s. So the strategy that they used was they would target Native people who didn't have the means and would deliberately overtax personal property, thereby kind of either pushing Native people off of their land or at the very least getting taxes from the personal property that they seized. In 1893, Lincoln County Assessor D.W. Ulam sent out the county sheriff to seize Keokuk's substantial holdings for unpaid taxes. And Keokuk just launched a temporary restraining order and then fought tooth and nail in first county, then state, and then finally the territorial Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it ended with a ruling that county officials could tax indigenous personal property, but history might have gone a different way had the federal government, and particularly the Office of Indian Affairs, intervened. There's substantial documentation that Keokuk and even the Indian agent at the Sac Fox Agency in Stroud were very frustrated that they could not offer significant legal help. But there were people who were able to take advantage of this and use it to actually make wealth. Catherine Griffenstein, a citizen Pottawatomi woman living along the South Canadian River, chose a different strategy. She was a daughter of a Pottawatomi politician and a German immigrant who was raised near Topeka, Kansas Territory. Now, I have been to Topeka, and it is not the biggest crossroads in the world. It's a nice town, but in the 1850s, it was a profoundly different place. Catherine Griffenstein lived there after her father had been forcibly removed from northern Michigan, along with lots of other indigenous people. If you remember, I was telling you about how all these different people lived in Kansas. Well, the Pottawatomi, the citizen Pottawatomi in particular, were one group that made their way to Kansas and expected to live there for the foreseeable future. Catherine Griffenstein was her family was extremely wealthy, savvy, multicultural, and well-connected at what was then a cosmopolitan crossroads. In the 1850s, Catherine's family lived on an estate so elaborate at Topeka that looters later scoured the entire area looking for buried treasure, of all things. Now, as I noted before, white settlers kind of pushed this native community out, and many indigenous peoples, including the citizen Pottawatomi, relocated to Indian Territory, which at that time in the 1870s was largely protected from settlers. Catherine Griffenstein actually managed to stay in Kansas. She married a man named William Griffenstein, a German immigrant. And together, the two of them became kind of a dynamic duo. William basically founded the city of Wichita, Kansas, by laying it out and building a mansion right in the middle. And he won several terms as mayor of Wichita. He was a very prominent figure in this region in the late 19th century, even though he's largely forgotten. Catherine Griffenstein gained a lease from the citizen Pottawatomi Nation to create the massive UF Ranch in Indian Territory. It was 400,000 acres. And the two of them build significant wealth. In the 1890s, Catherine Griffenstein takes an allotment of land held in trust by the federal government and begins using it in a way that is really intriguing if we look back at it. So she was aware the federal government was not enforcing the law in Pottawatomi County. Once Oklahoma Territory was created, there just wasn't significant monitoring going on. And understanding, because allotments are held in trust, they cannot be borrowed against, they can't be mortgaged, they can't be condemned except by a federal court. So because of that, technically speaking, you could really only lease or farm it yourself. But Catherine Griffenstein figured out a really interesting method of using her allotment to make wealth that relied principally on the federal government's inability to do anything in the county. So she built a town. Unlike non-native speculators building planned towns in the territory, Catherine Griffenstein was able to get the best lands before everybody else. She selected this allotment that was on the axis of the Little River, this lush, gently rolling valley. And you can still go to this river today, the valley. It's actually right here on the map. And it was also along the route of a planned railroad, the Santa Fe Railroad. And it was, at the time, was the anticipated geographical center of the future county. Now, once Pottawatomi County was adjusted and later on, the county border moved. And so modern Burnett, which there isn't really a town there anymore, but the location is actually in the southwestern part of the county. But prior to the territory's formation, that it looked like that was going to be the center. Rather than leasing the entire tract for grazing and tenant farming, Katherine Griswold, quote, laid out and platted the town of Burnett and began selling deeds. Now, you may wonder why this is such an innovative strategy. Well, if you read, for example, Michael Hightower's book on Oklahoma, to the formation of Oklahoma City, you'll note that early Oklahoma City was pretty dangerous. People contested each other's claims. Homesteaders frequently fought each other in court. Sometimes they just shot each other. The first mayor of Oklahoma City was killed over a homestead dispute. So there's just a lot of uncertainty in many of the land runs, including the 1891 land run that opened up what is now Cleveland, parts of Cleveland, Pottawatomi, Lincoln, and Payne counties. In contrast, Griffenstein could offer this orderly, certain space. And I'll just show you a picture here. We have one map that exists of Burnett, Oklahoma. The town only really lasted for about 10 years. And it was extremely successful until the railroad moved in 1903, in which point everybody moved to Macomb over here. You can see this town is planned. So there are many, many lots that can be leased out. This is 160 acres in total. Had a barn. It had a public park and kind of a square, and it's planned streets and lots. It was also surveyed in 1890, I believe 1892. Like I said, it was a planned town. By what records we do have, because the town didn't really last past 1903, even though it was founded in 1891. This Burnett, Oklahoma territory was extremely popular. It was about 600 people lived there in 1900, the majority of whom were white and paying for kind of renting different lots on this property, but a significant minority were also Pottawatomi. The last story I want to talk to you about today is a story that takes place in Cleveland County, and I think it's the most interesting, personally. I want to describe to you a way an Indigenous community found ways not only to address their present, but look forward into the future at the same time. And I'm going to talk about a concept called futurism. Anishinaabe philosopher Grace L. Dillon identified this way of looking at the world as futurity, or indigenous futurism. Now, futurism as an idea stems back from Africana studies, but in an indigenous context, these terms refer to a broad spectrum of actions indigenous people take in which, quote, progress is directing material or creative resources not towards growth, but community persistence. Rather than focusing only on individual success, people we might retroactively label indigenous futurists thought about the past, present, and future of the community as one narrative. Now, why am I talking about this? So the last community I want to talk to you about is right here. We're kind of the eastern shore of Lake Thunderbird. And the period I'm going to talk to you about is before Lake Thunderbird existed, but Absentee Shawnee people in what is in eastern Cleveland County, they made decisions that don't really make sense by kind of an Anglo-American point of view. They chose crappy land to farm on. They deliberately relocated there. They often cut themselves off. But from their viewpoint, with their goals in mind, they absolutely made sense. They articulated this idea of futurism in the way that they lived, in the choices that they made. Absentee Shawnee people in eastern Cleveland County chose to live on the margins of an economically dominant non-native society that valued whiteness to protect their own culture and land. And I would argue that they actually succeeded in ways that are pretty much unparalleled in many of the territories, many of the parts of Oklahoma. So Absentee Shawnee people are part of a broader group of Shawnee nations. They migrated to what is now Oklahoma in the 1850s, and the Big Jim community, which is the community I want to talk about to you today, formed in the 1870s. By the time the Big Jim community is living in what is now Pottawatomi County, the United States has tasked the Office of Indian Affairs with assimilating Native peoples and kind of suppressing their culture, and forcing them to live in a particular place. The Big Jim Shawnees were not interested in doing that. They first tried to live on the Kickapoo Reservation with similarly minded Kickapoo people who wanted to be able to do what they wanted to do. In 1886, the federal government forcibly removed them, burned their cabins, destroyed much of their property, to the point that the U.S. government actually compensated the Shawnees 5 years later in 1891. But once they did that, once they removed them in 1886 to another location off of the Kickapoo Reservation, Big Jim began to rethink what was going to happen going forward. We don't have a lot of records from Big Jim, but we do have a lot of oral histories and left by the Absentee Shawnee people. In those histories, Absentee Shawnee people argue that Big Jim deliberately decided to leave what the place they had been relocated to, which was this lush river valley that I already described to you, kind of the same place that the Griffensteins used in 1891. It was extremely productive land that was very, very valuable to white farmers, or was seen as very valuable to white farmers. So it would have been the direct target of grafters and organized crime that was really reshaping much of Oklahoma in the early 20th century. But Big Jim decided in 1888 to move his people to what is now eastern Cleveland County, which was a much less agriculturally productive place. It's sandy, it's very hilly. Even today, it's filled with brush and small wiry trees. But it served a really important purpose. It cut the Big Jim Shawnees off from the OIA. So Office of Indian Affairs officials responsible for monitoring the Big Jim Band soon found them to be, quote, in a rather remote territory, 10 to 15 miles from the railroad, with the wagon roads in poor condition. And those roads remained pretty poor until the 1960s, making it really difficult for the Office of Indian Affairs to get involved in kind of Absentee Shawnee business in Cleveland County. The Big Jim community could kind of do its own thing, it could preserve its language, it could protect its culture and raise children the way they wanted to. The Big Jim Band found real freedom in the forest. In comparison to the growth of white supremacy in other regions of Oklahoma, like Tulsa, Norman, and many other places, quote, practically no race consciousness existed in this area of Cleveland County that was very rural and very dense. Shawnee white children played together, attended school together, and lived next to one another. More than likely, their parents worked alongside one another in the region's booming moonshining operations. If you ever look at the records of the Indian agent who lived in Shawnee County, he's constantly talking about moonshiners in the area. I have a lot of trouble believing that Absentee Shawnee people were not involved in that if they were also involved with their neighbors. So I think that it makes a lot of sense that this area would be used for moonshining because eastern Cleveland County, like I said, is very rural, but it's near several large population centers like Shawnee, Norman, and Oklahoma City. So it would be a great place to manufacture liquor. And if you'll remember, Oklahoma was a dry state from 1907 to 1959. So there was a lot of demand, but not a lot of places to actually manufacture liquor and other kinds of alcohol. The forest also provided Shawnee people with opportunities to evade the OIA's longstanding ban on indigenous religious and cultural ceremonies. We have a lot of interesting reports, particularly from newspapers, that county sheriffs would routinely go to Absentee Shawnee cultural centers, stomp dances, and other dances that I don't want to get too much into because I think that their religious significance is something I don't want to casually overlook. But the records of those indicate that the Cleveland County Sheriff essentially didn't care about these ceremonies and just kind of would go to the thing and then would leave and kind of leave the Absentee Shawnees alone. What that did was it allowed the Absentee Shawnees in eastern Cleveland County to continue practicing vital ceremonies and hold on to knowledge that was lost in other communities that were closer to the Office of Indian Affairs and were under much more stringent surveillance. There were negatives to living in this area. The Absentee Shawnees exhausted the land along with their neighbors. Almost everyone farmed out the area by kind of the 1930s, at which point the soil was just exhausted. But that was worth it to the Big Jim Band. They evaded government surveillance and were able to protect what was most important to them. They were also able to protect their form of government. From the 1890s onward, Big Jim and his contemporaries refused to cooperate with the OAA. And I should say, this picture of Big Jim is by an artist named Ernest Spybuck, the most prominent Absentee Shawnee artist of the 20th century. This is a great picture of Big Jim. Big Jim and his successor, Little Jim, maintained that their band of people was independent and sovereign. Even today, the Big Jim Band has its own identity within the Absentee Shawnee government, which is actually two different bands of people. So for the most part, though, they were able to retain their form of government because the OIA just couldn't really do much in the forest. Little Jim maintained his people were independent and sovereign into the 1960s. The Big Jim Shawnees also retained their lands. So it's important to know, right, that on the heels of the county administrations in Cleveland, Pottawatomi and Lincoln counties harassing Native people and taking their lands, once those lands fall out of trust in the 1910s and 1920s, grafters and thieves just go after them. I mean, they just swindle Native people out of everything they have. It is remarkable, just the amount of organized crime and the amount of human carnage that happens in across Oklahoma, but particularly in Cleveland County. And looking at the records of the OIA, the Office of Indian Affairs, land is just flying out of the agency. And the OIA agents know that bad things are happening. It's not that they don't care, but they essentially are unable to monitor stuff because they're not paid very well. There's not enough people, and they're not really being careful with the land that they take out of trust. So there's all this native land is being lost in Pottawatomi and Lincoln County. Interestingly, Cleveland County's land records show next to no sale of native land. So there's this indication that the Big Jim Shawnees are able to kind of maintain solidarity. And because their land is not great anyway, at least in kind of Anglo-American agricultural terms, it's not particularly attractive to grafters and thieves. In the 1930s, one of Big Jim's contemporaries remembered that the Shawnee leader, quote, believed, quote, the earth was his mother and he would never turn it up and separate the land into quarter sections. That has always been the policy of the descendants of that great chief, end quote. I want to talk a little bit about why this is important. So native title in the United States remains in flux. This is true in Oklahoma as it is a lot of other places. I just simply want to say that that understanding the past, understanding these cases of Katherine Griswold, of Moses Keokuk, of the Big Jim community, helps us understand how there were different possibilities in the early 20th century. There were ways that Native people found to persist, and it proves that the future remained in flux. Today, that is also the case. Indigenous nations are resurgent, but they are opposed by what I would argue is a fairly hostile administration, by state administration that often does not understand or have much regard for Native sovereignty. And so it's important to not just dismiss the continuing struggle, but to we need to be allies and work towards recognizing Native sovereignty, both in the government of Oklahoma, but also just in everyday life.
All right. Thank you, John, for that presentation. We do have a few questions in the chat. We've got just a few minutes to go over some questions. We're going to start with this question that came in. Do you think the McGregor case will have an impact on these nations that you described, or just on the 5 tribes? Oh, John, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm honestly not sure. I know the McGregor case primarily relies on the idea that the 5 tribes were never extinguished by Congress, right? Their governments, because everybody thinks that the Curtis Act ended the five tribes governments, but that didn't actually occur. It just set the stage for it. I think it would depend on the individual nation, but I'm also not a lawyer, and so McGregor is a really complicated issue.
Yeah, and we'll have more information about that tomorrow. We'll have a presentation on the McGregor case.
I think it is it's exciting. There's a lot of really great people talking about that topic.
Let me see. Diane asks, how did one become an Indian agent?
Sure. So the Office of Indian Affairs was sort of like a civil bureaucracy that existed, and it really expanded in the late 19th century. Typically, it was sometimes it was by someone who was skilled at their job. Most of the time, it was a political appointment, and so you got a lot of people who were not particularly really understand the law relating to Indigenous people. And if you're familiar at all with Indian law, it's complicated and confusing because it goes back on itself. But that was typically how you got it. Like a congressional official would recommend you for an agent position, or there's a lot of different ways people would get those positions. And sometimes there was sometimes you had a good agent, but most of the time it was.
In the course of your research, have you found a similar exploitation of land ownership of the formerly enslaved people of the five tribes?
Yeah, although actually I would recommend, there's some really great books by like Elena Roberts and I'm trying to think, I think Greg Zellar, and there's a lot of resources on the freedmen. They lose their trust restrictions much more quickly than some of, and that's actually more of a, that's the way it's set up by the U.S. Congress, and particularly by Oklahoma's congressional delegation. So that's less, it's complicated, but essentially I think the orgy kind of hits the freedmen harder than it does Indigenous people generally in Eastern Oklahoma.
Since you've mentioned some other sources, the Luther Library folks have asked, you mentioned Angie Debo, obviously at the beginning, but are there other sources that you recommend to explore this topic?
Sure. So, and hi to everybody over there in Luther. So I think there's a lot of academic resources. There's also a lot of really interesting oral histories and kind of documents from people. There's of course stuff with Oklahoma Historical Society, specifically talking about histories in this era. I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is probably Rose Strumlau's book on allotment in the Cherokee Nation. It's a really interesting read. There's a number of resources, though. This field's kind of getting revitalized by a lot of people coming out of different places, particularly the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So if you've ever read David Chang's book, The Color of the Land, that's another great one. It talks about the Creek Nation and kind of sovereignty, and also how race shapes land ownership in that area.
Mike asks that you mentioned the personal property taxes that were levied on these Indigenous people. Were those the same type of taxes that were leveled on the white settlers there?
Yeah, so personal property taxes are on everybody. And at the beginning, it's not clear whether personal property taxes can be levied on Indigenous people on federal land. And Keokuk via Ulam kind of resolves that and says we can levy personal property taxes on Indigenous people, even if they're living on land held in federal trust. However, I think I got this across in the presentation, but I want to reiterate it. the county assessor who was evaluating how much something was worth when he was he so like somebody like DW, and this is well documented, they tended to overestimate how much indigenous property, personal property, was worth, and then would try to overtax indigenous people deliberately, and then would take that money from that they seized from indigenous people and would use it to fund their police force, and then go after the same people again.
We have a question from Amber. What impact do you think the Native diaspora has had on family connections and Native identity?
That's a large question. It's a big one. I mean, I think it's really, really complicated. You know, for one thing, I mean, if you're going to talk about a Native diaspora, right, you got to talk about, you know, the 1950s, where the federal Alice, that results in things like the American Indian movement later on, and that, you know, just new indigenous urban identities. It's, I don't know, it's a very, very complicated question. I'd say, I think the best example I can think of to encapsulate a quick answer there is that the novel There by Tommy Orange talks about indigenous identity and being Native in Los Angeles, and kind of being part of a diaspora that's multi-tribal. I think his voice like that.
And Douglas Miller's new book, Indians on the Move, talks about the diaspora into the urban areas as well. So that's another resource to look into.
Absolutely. He's presenting, I think.
Yeah, he's on one of the on-demand sessions talking about Jesse Ed Davis. And then we've got one more question from Angela. If you've got other questions, go ahead and get them in right now. Are the works that describe the allotment process as it affected Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen who were allotted 1/8 the amount of land of intermarried whites and those classified by blood, are there resources on the county level to explore?
Sorry, can you repeat? I think I cut out for a second.
Yeah, I think we're having some freezing problems.
Are you talking about?
It's talking about Chickasaw and Choctaw freedmen, and the differences between basically finding resources on the county level to explore, to find information about Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen, and the differences between the amount of lands that were allotted, it sounds like, is what she's wanting to find.
So that actually was a matter of federal policy. Freedmen got us, depending on who you're talking about, freedmen got a certain amount of land, and then quote, I don't like using this term, but it was the term that was used at the time, quote, full blood people got a certain amount of land, and then mixed blood people got, you know, what differed a little bit was that, and this really depends on particularly with the 5 tribes, because some members of, like say if you're, some members got more than others depending on how they negotiated with the federal government. The way that trust, there's actually a really good, if you want to pick up The Color of Land by David Chang, it's a great little chart he has that differentiates Creek land ownership and the way that those legal restrictions work. For Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen, I would check out Elena Roberts' book that just came out. I've Been Here All the While, I think Black Freedom on Native Land. And then I believe there are some works on Choctaw freedmen. There's not as much, but I do believe there's some stuff in the Oklahoma Historical Society. Check that out. And then, you know, county level land research is going to be, you know, you would go to the county courthouse, not the county courthouse, I'm sorry, the county administration, and they're going to have land records starting at the beginning of each county.
Okay. We have time for just like one or two more questions. The one person's asking if you're publishing your research.
Yep. Different places.
And then they're asking, just for clarification, does mixed blood mean more than one tribe or mixed white and indigenous?
So that's a nice complicated question too. So mixed blood often actually referred to this category. It was really arbitrary and kind of often inaccurate, but it referred to a level of assimilation where, and is usually applied by non-native people onto native people to say like, they haven't progressed as much into being an American, and then mixed blood people have progressed more. Now, again, I want to really, really emphasize that they're for one thing racial stereotypes, but also like really oversimplify what is a much more complex dynamic. But they did, if you want to check out Catherine Ellinghouse's book, Blood Will Tell, talks a lot about how the idea of blood quantum, which is the, you know, the level of indigenous blood that you have, which is this really weird way of measuring somebody's native identity, but talks about how that is central to understanding the allotment process and just this whole era in Oklahoma. So that's Catherine Ellinghouse, Blood Will Tell.
And one last question, where are you going to be publishing your work?
In different places. I'm still writing my dissertation. We'll see. I'd like to, I don't know, maybe Yale or something, Yale University Press, maybe North Carolina. I'm not sure. It'll be a while, but I've also, there's a bunch of different stuff. There's there's an article on the Big Gym community kind of that's coming out in Oklahoma Humanities in a couple of months, and then there's other examples as well. I try to get my research out in publicly accessible ways because I think that's the right thing to do.
And you have an article on a similar but different topic that will be coming out in the Chronicles of Oklahoma sometime in the next few months. So. Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure listening to your presentation, and we appreciate it. And thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations today and tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.